The engine compartment of a Sherman tank reaches 400 degrees Fahrenheit during sustained operation. The exhaust manifold, depending on the engine variant, can exceed 700. The turbocharger housing on an aircraft engine at full military power glows cherry red, hot enough to ignite any organic material that contacts it. The space behind the crew compartment of a Sherman, where 30 tons of steel are propelled by an engine burning gasoline or diesel at full military power, is a furnace enclosed in armor plate. The men sitting 4 feet away from this furnace, separated from it by a steel bulkhead, can feel the heat radiating through the metal on their backs. Between the crew of 5 and that furnace is a steel bulkhead called the firewall. In 1941, the firewall alone was not enough. Steel conducts heat. A 1/4-inch steel plate separating 5 men from a 700-degree exhaust manifold does not protect them from the heat, it transmits it. Touch the firewall during sustained operation and you will burn your palm. The crew compartment becomes an oven. The temperature inside a buttoned-up Sherman in summer, operating at full power, can reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit, even without considering heat transfer from the engine. With the radiated and conducted heat from the engine bay, the fighting compartment approaches the limits of human endurance. The ammunition stored inside the hull becomes dangerously warm. The rubber seals on the periscopes soften and lose their integrity. The paint on the interior walls blisters and peels. The men sweat through their uniforms and learn painfully and quickly not to touch any metal surface with bare skin. What was needed was insulation, something that could be pressed against the firewall, wrapped around exhaust pipes, packed into the gaps between engine and hull that would absorb the heat and refuse to pass it through. Something that would not burn, something that would not melt, something that was light enough to not add meaningful weight to a vehicle already pushing the limits of its suspension and transmission. Something cheap enough to produce in the millions of square feet required to insulate every tank, every truck, every half-track, every jeep, every aircraft, and every warship being built by the largest military-industrial mobilization in human history. There was only one material on Earth that met every one of these requirements. It was fibrous, it was flexible, it could be woven into cloth, pressed into sheets, mixed into cement, sprayed onto surfaces, wrapped around pipes, and stuffed into any gap or cavity that needed protection from heat or flame. It was naturally occurring, mined from the ground like iron ore, available in enormous quantities from deposits in Canada, South Africa, and the Soviet Union. It did not burn at any temperature a military vehicle would encounter. It did not conduct heat. It did not conduct electricity. It was resistant to chemical corrosion, and it was cheap, astonishingly, almost absurdly cheap. The material was asbestos, and the company that supplied more of it to the American military than any other entity on Earth was the Johns-Manville Corporation of New York. This is a story about a material that saved lives in the short term and destroyed them in the long term. It is a story about a corporation that knew the truth and buried it. And it is a story that the men who fought the war never learned until it was too late, because the enemy that asbestos planted in their lungs did not announce itself for 20, 30, 40 years after the last shot was fired. By then, the men were old. By then, the filing cabinets that held the evidence were locked. By then, the executives who made the decisions were dead. But the fibers were still there, lodged in the tissue of a generation that thought it had survived the war. Asbestos is not a single mineral. It is a commercial term for a group of 6 naturally occurring silicate minerals that share a common property. They form long, thin, flexible fibers that can be separated and woven like thread. The most common variety, chrysotile, also called white asbestos, accounts for roughly 95% of all asbestos used commercially. It is mined from serpentine rock deposits, primarily in Canada's Quebec province, where the town of Asbestos, population 6,000, was named for the mineral that sustained it. The properties of asbestos were known to the ancient world. The Greeks used it for lamp wicks. The The Romans wove it into cremation cloths for their emperors so that the ashes could be separated from the funeral pyre. Charlemagne is said to have impressed dinner guests by throwing a tablecloth into the fire and pulling it out unburned. The word itself comes from a Greek term meaning inextinguishable. For most of human history, asbestos was a curiosity, a parlor trick, a novelty fiber that resisted flame. It did not become an industrial commodity until the late 19th century, when the Industrial Revolution created machines that generated heat, friction, and the constant risk of fire, and engineers realized that nature had already produced the perfect insulator. Henry Ward Johns recognized the opportunity before almost anyone else. In 1858, at the age of 21, he founded the H.W. Johns Manufacturing Company in New York City and began producing roofing materials made with asbestos. In 1886, Charles Brayton Manville founded the Manville Covering Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, manufacturing asbestos heat insulation for industrial pipes and boilers. The two companies merged in 1901 to form the H.W. Johns-Manville Company. By the 1920s, Johns-Manville was the largest manufacturer of asbestos products in the world. By the time it went public on the New York Stock Exchange in 1927, it was also one of the most profitable. Johns-Manville did not merely sell asbestos products, it owned the mines. The company operated the world's largest asbestos mine in Quebec, Canada, extracting raw chrysotile fiber from open pits and processing it into dozens of commercial products. Insulation for pipes, insulation for boilers, roofing shingles, cement sheets, floor tiles, brake linings, clutch facings, gaskets, fireproofing spray, electrical wire coating, acoustic ceiling tiles. The company's product catalog was a monument to asbestos's versatility, and every page represented revenue that depended on the continued belief that asbestos was safe. It was not safe, and Johns-Manville knew it. The evidence began accumulating as early as 1929, when 11 Johns-Manville employees filed disability claims, complaining that they were developing lung diseases from working with asbestos. The company settled the claims quietly, out of court, under a secrecy order that prevented the workers from discussing the terms or the underlying health complaints. This pattern, settle and silence, would become the corporate standard for the next 50 years. In 1933, Dr. Anthony J. Lanza, the medical director of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, reported findings to Johns-Manville that asbestos exposure causes lung disease. The company and its attorneys reviewed the report and successfully pressured Lanza to soften the language before publication, removing the most alarming conclusions. A letter from a Johns-Manville attorney, later introduced as evidence in court proceedings, acknowledged the health hazards of asbestos and recommended that the company manage the information to avoid potential litigation. In 1943, the Ceramac Laboratory in New York, funded by Johns-Manville itself to study the health effects of its own products, confirmed the link between asbestos exposure and cancer. The laboratory's director, Dr. Leroy Gardner, conducted the research under a contractual provision that prohibited him from publishing his findings without Johns-Manville's express permission. The company reviewed the results and declined to authorize publication of the most damaging conclusions. Gardner died in 1946, having never published the most critical parts of his research. Shortly before his death, he expressed anguish to colleagues about the suppression, understanding that his silence was contributing to ongoing exposure of millions of workers and soldiers. The suppression continued into the post-war era. In 1952, Johns-Manville's own medical director, Dr. Kenneth Smith, warned company executives about the dangers of asbestos insulation. His warnings were received and filed. No action was taken. No warnings were issued to workers or customers. In 1976, a quarter century later, Smith testified in court about the warnings he had given and the corporate response, which was no response at all. The executives he had warned were, by then, retired or dead. The workers he had tried to protect were, by then, developing the diseases he had predicted. The men who signed these suppression orders knew what asbestos did to human lungs. They knew that the fibers, when inhaled, are too small to be filtered by the body's natural defenses, too durable to be broken down by the immune system, and too sharp to be expelled by coughing. They lodge in the pleural lining of the lungs, and they stay there for decades. The body's immune response to the persistent foreign material creates chronic inflammation. The inflammation, over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, causes scarring of the lung tissue, a condition called asbestosis. In some cases, the inflammation triggers the uncontrolled cell division that is cancer. The most lethal form is mesothelioma, a cancer of the pleural lining that is almost exclusively caused by asbestos exposure, and that is, in nearly every case, fatal. The executives at Johns-Manville knew this. They buried it. And then Pearl Harbor happened, and the United States government came to them with the largest order in the company's history. The scale of American military production between 1941 and 1945 is difficult to comprehend without numbers, and the numbers are difficult to comprehend even when you have them. The United States built 49,234 Sherman tanks. It built 88,000 landing craft. It built 2,710 Liberty ships. It built 324,000 military aircraft. It built 2.4 million military trucks. It built 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Every one of these objects required insulation, fireproofing, or heat-resistant components. Every truck had brake linings. Every tank had clutch facings, engine gaskets, and firewall insulation. Every aircraft had wiring insulation, engine compartment linings, and heat shields around exhaust systems. Every ship had boiler insulation, pipe lagging, and bulkhead fireproofing. The demand for asbestos was not merely large, it was oceanic. American asbestos production responded accordingly. In 1932, the United States produced 18,198 tons of asbestos. By 1943, production had reached 783,611 tons, an increase of over 4,000% in 11 years. The U.S. Navy alone consumed more than 300 million pounds of asbestos between 1940 and 1970. Johns-Manville was the largest single supplier. At its wartime peak, the company had over 30,000 employees across dozens of plants and mines, operating around the clock to meet military specifications that required asbestos in nearly every piece of equipment the armed forces used. Inside a Sherman tank, asbestos was everywhere. The firewall between the crew compartment and the engine compartment was insulated with asbestos blankets and sheets. The exhaust pipes were wrapped in asbestos lagging to prevent heat from radiating into the hull. The brake linings were made from asbestos friction material, typically containing between 35 and 60% chrysotile fiber, because asbestos could absorb the enormous heat generated by braking a 30-ton vehicle without degrading or catching fire. The clutch facings were asbestos. The gaskets that sealed the engine block, the water pump, the fuel system, and dozens of other joints where metal met metal at high temperatures were made with asbestos. The electrical wiring throughout the vehicle was insulated with asbestos-impregnated cloth. Armored vehicles that carried ammunition had additional asbestos insulation lining the hull as fire retardant, because a single spark in an ammunition compartment would kill every man inside. The soldiers and Marines who operated these vehicles did not know any of this. They climbed into Shermans and half-tracks and Jeeps and did not know that the material insulating the firewall behind them was slowly shedding microscopic fibers into the air they breathed. They did not know because nobody told them, and nobody told them because the only entity that possessed the knowledge had decided that the information was a business liability rather than a public health obligation. The tank mechanics who maintained and repaired these vehicles bore the heaviest exposure of any group in the Army outside of shipyard workers. Consider the routine of a tank mechanic in a maintenance company somewhere in France or Italy or the Pacific. A Sherman comes in with worn brake linings. The mechanic pulls the brake drums, a heavy physical task on a 30-ton vehicle. He examines the brake shoes. The linings are worn down to the rivets. He removes the shoes and uses a compressed air hose to blow the brake dust out of the drum, sending a visible cloud of gray-white powder into the air of the maintenance tent. That powder is 35 to 60% chrysotile asbestos fiber. He breathes it. His assistant breathes it. Every man working within 20 feet breathes it. Then he installs new linings, tests the brakes, and moves on to the next vehicle. Or consider the mechanic replacing a head gasket on an R975 radial engine. He strips the old gasket from the mating surfaces, scraping hardened asbestos material off cast iron with a wire brush and a putty knife. The scraping generates a fine powder that rises into the air and settles on every surface in the engine compartment. He works with his face 18 inches from the gasket surface because the engine compartment of a Sherman is not designed for human comfort. He breathes the dust for the duration of the job, which may take several hours. He does this job dozens of times over the course of the war. He does it without a respirator, without even a paper dust mask, because nobody has told him that the gasket material is dangerous. Nobody has told him because the company that manufactured the gasket decided in 1934 that telling him would be bad for business. The artillerymen wore asbestos gloves. Gunners in armored vehicles wore asbestos mittens to handle hot ammunition casings. These gloves slowly disintegrated with use, shedding fibers with every flex of the hand, releasing them into the air around the gunner's face. The wiring in every military vehicle was insulated with asbestos-impregnated cloth, and whenever a wire was cut, spliced, or stripped during repair, the asbestos coating crumbled and released fibers. The exhaust pipes wrapped in asbestos lagging degraded with the heat cycling of the engine, and the vibration of movement caused the wrapping to slowly powder and disintegrate, releasing fibers into the engine compartment and, through imperfect seals, into the crew compartment. And asbestos was not only in vehicles, it was in every environment the military built or occupied. The barracks were insulated with asbestos. The mess halls had asbestos floor tiles and ceiling tiles. The heating systems were wrapped in asbestos pipe insulation. The ammunition depots were fireproofed with asbestos spray. But the worst exposure, by far, was in the shipyards. The construction of the American wartime fleet was the largest single concentration of asbestos use in human history. Every warship, from aircraft carriers to destroyer escorts, was insulated with asbestos from keel to masthead. The boilers that generated steam to drive the turbines were wrapped in asbestos blankets. The steam pipes that ran from the boiler rooms to the engine rooms were lagged with asbestos insulation, hundreds of feet of pipe per ship, wrapped layer upon layer. The bulkheads that divided the ship into watertight compartments were fireproofed with sprayed asbestos. The electrical cables that ran through every passageway were insulated with asbestos-impregnated cloth. The turbine rooms, the generator rooms, the pump rooms, every space on the ship that contained machinery was saturated with asbestos materials. The men who built these ships worked in the asbestos dust without protection. Shipyard workers described conditions where the dust was so thick that you could not see the man working 10 feet away. They called themselves snowmen because the white asbestos fibers covered them from head to toe. They ate their lunches in the shipyard with asbestos dust on their hands and in their food. They went home at the end of their shifts with asbestos fibers embedded in their clothing, and when their wives washed those clothes, the fibers were released into the air of their homes, exposing their families. The phenomenon was called second-hand asbestos exposure, and it would produce mesothelioma cases in wives and children who had never set foot in a shipyard. The Navy alone built or converted thousands of vessels during the war, and the aggregate volume of asbestos installed in them defies comprehension. Over 300 million pounds of asbestos were used in U.S. naval applications between 1940 and 1970. Much of that was installed during the furious wartime construction program that produced the fleet that defeated Japan and supported the invasion of Europe. Navy veterans, as a population, have some of the highest rates of mesothelioma of any group ever studied, a direct legacy of the asbestos that was woven into every surface and system of the ships they sailed. The aircraft factories were no better. Bombers and fighters used asbestos in engine compartment linings, brake systems, heat shields around exhaust manifolds, gaskets throughout the engine, and fireproof coatings on structural components. The P-38 Lightning, the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-29 Super Fortress, every major American combat aircraft contained asbestos components. Aircraft mechanics who maintained these planes in hangars and on flight lines breathed asbestos fibers every time they worked on an engine, replaced a brake assembly, or stripped old gaskets. Even aircraft that left the factory without asbestos had asbestos-containing parts installed during routine maintenance and repair, because asbestos was the standard material for heat-resistant and fire-resistant applications, and no alternative was offered. There was virtually no environment in the American military during the Second World War that was free of asbestos fibers. Johns-Manville thrived during the war. Revenue soared, production expanded. The company positioned itself as a vital contributor to national defense. In July 1945, it raised $17 million through a new stock issue. In 1946, it launched a $50 million expansion program to build new plants and research centers. In 1947, it acquired the Goetz Gasket and Packing Company. In 1956, it executed a $40 million expansion plan focused primarily on asbestos cement pipe production. In 1958, it purchased the Libby Owens Ford Glass Fibers Company for $55 million in stock, expanding into fiberglass while continuing to expand its asbestos operations. Throughout all of this growth, the company maintained its policy of suppressing health information. Workers continued to get sick. The company continued to settle claims quietly. The medical evidence continued to accumulate. And the veterans, the millions of men who had served between 1941 and 1945 and breathed asbestos fibers every day of their service, went home, got jobs, raised families, and did not think about the dust. The latency period of asbestos-related diseases is one of the cruelest facts in medicine. It turns exposure into a time bomb with a fuse measured in decades. Asbestosis, the scarring disease, typically appears 10 to 20 years after sustained exposure. The patient develops progressive shortness of breath. The lung tissue, scarred by years of inflammation around embedded fibers, loses its elasticity. The lungs cannot expand fully. The gas exchange that keeps the blood oxygenated becomes less efficient. The patient breathes faster, tires more easily, develops a persistent dry cough. The disease is incurable. It can only be managed. It progresses slowly over years, reducing the patient's capacity until breathing itself becomes the central struggle of existence. Mesothelioma is worse. It typically takes 20 to 50 years to develop after initial exposure. It is a cancer of the mesothelium, the thin membrane that lines the chest cavity and surrounds the lungs. It does not respond well to chemotherapy. It does not respond well to radiation. It cannot be meaningfully treated with surgery in most cases because by the time it produces symptoms, it has spread along the pleural surface in a pattern that cannot be excised. The median survival time after diagnosis is 12 to 21 months. It is, with vanishingly rare exceptions, a death sentence delivered decades after the exposure that caused it. A 19-year-old tank mechanic who breathed asbestos dust in a motor pool in Normandy in 1944 would not develop symptoms until the 1960s at the earliest, and possibly not until the 1990s. By then, he would be in his 60s or 70s. He would go to a doctor complaining of shortness of breath and chest pain. The doctor would order imaging. The imaging would show pleural thickening, fluid accumulation, a mass that should not be there. The diagnosis would come, and the mechanic, now an old man, would try to trace the exposure back through the decades, back through a lifetime of work and family and ordinary living, to the months he spent in a maintenance tent in France, blowing brake dust into the air with a compressed air hose, breathing it in because nobody had told him not to. By then, the army that had exposed him no longer existed in its wartime form. The specific maintenance tent was gone. The specific brake pads and gaskets he had handled were dust. The company that had supplied the materials had gone through reorganizations, mergers, and a landmark bankruptcy. The executives who had decided to suppress the health data were dead. The attorney who wrote the 1934 letter recommending concealment was dead. Only the fibers remained, lodged in the old man's pleura, having waited 40 years to kill him. The reckoning began in the 1970s. The first major legal victory against an asbestos company came in 1973 when the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in favor of the widow of Clarence Borel, an industrial insulation worker who had used Johns-Manville products from 1936 until he became too sick to work in 1969. The court held that the manufacturers had failed to warn Borel about the dangers of their products. Johns-Manville was one of 11 companies named in the suit. The ruling was a crack in the dam. By 1979, Johns-Manville faced approximately 1,500 lawsuits. By 1981, the number had grown to 9,300 lawsuits brought by 12,800 individuals. Many of the plaintiffs were veterans, men who had served in the Navy, who had installed asbestos insulation in the boiler rooms and engine rooms of warships. Men who had served in the Army, who had maintained tanks and trucks in North Africa and Europe and the Pacific. Men who had never heard of mesothelioma until the doctor told them they had it. In 1982, Johns-Manville filed for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 11. At the time, it was the largest company ever to seek bankruptcy in the United States. It was a Fortune 500 company. It had been a component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average since 1930. Its products were in every building, every vehicle, every pipe, and every ceiling in America, and it was drowning in lawsuits from the people it had poisoned. The bankruptcy reorganization resulted in the creation of the Manville Personal Injury Settlement Trust in 1988, funded with an initial $2.5 billion. By 2012, the trust had paid approximately $4.3 billion on 773,990 claims. Those numbers are staggering and insufficient. The trust's payment rate, reduced over the years as claims overwhelmed the fund, had dropped to approximately 5% of the approved claim value by the 2020s. A mesothelioma victim with an approved claim of several $100,000 might receive $17,000. The math of corporate accountability, spread across hundreds of thousands of victims, produces numbers that are individually insulting. In 2001, Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's conglomerate, acquired Johns-Manville. The company continues to operate today, manufacturing insulation and construction products made from fiberglass and polyurethane. It no longer uses asbestos. The mine in Quebec that once supplied the world's largest asbestos operation closed. The town of Asbestos, Quebec, renamed itself Val des Sources in 2020, shedding the identity that had defined it for over a century. Here is what the veterans of the Second World War were never told. They were never told that the brake pads they replaced with their bare hands contained up to 60% asbestos fiber. They were never told that the gaskets they scraped off engine blocks with wire brushes released invisible fibers that penetrated deep into their lungs and stayed there permanently. They were never told that the insulation blankets lining the firewalls of their tanks were shedding carcinogenic fibers with every hour of operation. They were never told that the company supplying these materials had known since 1929 that its products caused lung disease, had known since 1933 that the evidence was strong enough to require action, and had known since 1943 that its products caused cancer. They were never told because the company that held the information chose not to share it, and the military that specified asbestos in its equipment had no reason to question a material that was standard across every industry in the country. The veterans were told that asbestos was a miracle, and it was. It was a genuine, scientifically verifiable miracle of nature. A mineral that does not burn, a fiber that resists temperatures that would destroy any organic material, a substance that can be woven into cloth, molded into shapes, and sprayed onto surfaces to provide protection against the most fundamental and ancient enemy of human technology, fire. Asbestos saved lives during the war. The firewall insulation in a Sherman tank protected crews from engine fires. The brake linings prevented brake fade during descents that would have otherwise sent 30 tons of steel careening off a mountain road. The boiler insulation on Navy ships kept sailors from being burned alive in engine rooms. The gaskets sealed systems that, if they leaked, would have sprayed fuel or coolant onto surfaces hot enough to ignite them. Asbestos did exactly what it was supposed to do. It was a perfect material for the job it was given. The problem was not what it did to fire. The problem was what it did to lungs. And the men who profited from it knew the difference and chose to protect their revenue instead of their customers. The Sherman tank is gone from the battlefield. The last combat use of American-supplied Shermans was decades ago. The brake pads and gaskets and insulation blankets that Johns-Manville manufactured for those tanks have crumbled into dust. But the fibers have not crumbled. Asbestos fibers do not biodegrade, they do not dissolve, they do not weaken with time. They are as sharp and as durable in 2026 as they were in 1943. Inside the lungs of veterans who were still alive, who are now in their 90s and 100s, the fibers remain. Inside the lungs of veterans who died of mesothelioma at 70, at 80, at 65, the fibers remained until the body was cremated or buried, and they remain still in the ground where the bodies lie. The Henry Ward Johns who founded the company in 1858 died in 1998. His death certificate listed the cause as dust phthisis pneumonitis, an archaic medical term for lung disease caused by inhaling dust. He was 60 years old. He had spent decades working with the material that bore his name, breathing its fibers, and it killed him. The company he founded continued to sell asbestos products for another 87 years after his death, to a cumulative total of hundreds of millions of customers and workers and soldiers and sailors, while suppressing the evidence that the material was lethal. The story of asbestos in the Second World War is not a story of villains who chose evil over good. It is a story of a system that optimized for the immediate problem and externalized the cost to the future. The immediate problem was fire. The future cost was cancer. The system chose to solve the immediate problem because the immediate problem was killing people today, visibly, in flames, and the future cost would not become visible for decades. By then, the decision-makers would be retired or dead. The liability would be someone else's problem. The veterans would file their claims and receive their settlements and die wondering why the country they had fought for had poisoned them with the equipment it gave them to fight with. Every war leaves wounds that do not appear on the battlefield. The asbestos that insulated the engines of the American war machine was one of those wounds. It was invisible, it was patient, and it was everywhere. And the men who breathed it were never warned because the company that sold it had decided, in writing, in letters that survive in court archives, that warning them would be bad for business. Henry Ward Johns knew what asbestos did to lungs. He died of it. His company sold it for another 87 years. $750,000 claims have been filed. $4.3 billion have been paid, and the fibers are still in the ground with the men who carried them home from the war. That is the cost of a miracle material. It is still being counted.